Hey there, IoTeX community. We got a really special treat for you. We have an interview today with Anoop Nannra, the global blockchain segment leader at Amazon and previous head of global blockchain ventures at Cisco. Welcome, Anoop. Please start by introducing yourself.
Thanks, Larry, and thanks to the community for being part of this podcast. Yes, I'm Anoop Nannra. I'm the global segment leader for blockchain at AWS. I've been in the blockchain space for about 5-6 years now, and started out in late 2014 or 2015. Back at Cisco when we asked the question, what would it mean for networking and infrastructure to have an impact on the Bitcoin space, right? And so starting off on kind of the enterprise, non-enterprise applications of, well, just the cryptocurrency world. And then we kind of evolved our own internal thinking around blockchain to think about it from an enterprise context. So, been around the road, done a lot of interesting work in around security and video and media, and I see this new world of blockchain that we're living in as the intersection of several really great industries, but then also, if I step back and look at blockchain more broadly, I look at it as a mechanism for democratizing innovation more broadly, right? Well, it's not just technology innovation; it's also business model innovation as well. And sort of, there's a growing and exciting space as it is. But that's kind of my take on it.
Definitely. And throughout this podcast, we're really going to download your insights from your long history, both in the traditional tech space and now in this blockchain tech space as well. But you've been at the forefront of technological innovation for the past couple decades. Maybe just start with some of your fondest memories. How has that evolved over time?
My fondest memory was when we had to not only build but invent a fully meshed DWDM optical network in less than a month.
Now break that down. What is a mesh DWDM network for the?
So it's an optical network. So transceivers, receivers, transmitters, switches, where you have multiple lambdas of laser light being shone through a network, right? And so we had to come up with a model that allowed us to uniquely and individually tag lambdas of light. So lasers, and do it in such a way where we could actually detect when an optical network had been compromised, whether physically compromised or just from a signal path compromise. How do we kind of measure those things? So that was really exciting, and it was something we were really under the gun for. We had to complete that in 4 weeks. So not only come up with how to do it, but then to actually build a prototype, and that was one of my more exciting projects.
Okay.
Now living the blockchain life, right? So living life one block at a time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it sounds like very reminiscent of what's going on in the blockchain industry, right? Rapid development, pushing out brand new products that have real long-term value in just a very short time. But
Yeah.
that's kind of the opposite of how the enterprise space operates, right? You and I, we met in 2018 as part of the Trusted IoT Alliance, which
Yeah.
kind of brought together a lot of these enterprises just to start looking at the blockchain space. But during your time at Cisco and now at AWS, you focus on more of the enterprise application of blockchain technology. So how does that mindset of rapid iteration in the public chain space kind of synchronize with the enterprise needs? Like how's the overall receptiveness from enterprises evolved over time?
That's a great question. I would say that what we're seeing out of enterprises is a lot more comfort, right, in the technology and the outcomes that it can enable. We're no longer having to go into an enterprise and educate them on what blockchain is, right? Uh, enterprise customers generally know what blockchain is. What they're trying to figure out is, does it fit within their business and does it fit within their ecosystem, right? And so, from that perspective, I'm really optimistic about a more enterprise adoption of blockchain technology. I would say it's still early days, right? I mean, even though some of us have been in this space 5 years plus, and 10 years for the kind of the very early innovators, it's still early. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But some of the hard questions are getting easier to answer, like why would somebody need blockchain in their business or in their ecosystem, right? I think that's getting easier to answer. But then also looking at what's happening on the public side and mainnet, mainnets, if you will. There's a lot of really exciting and innovative work that's happened, and I believe, my own personal belief is that we're on a journey where today we started off with enterprise blockchains, and they're permissioned and they're private, to the other end of the spectrum, which is public, completely open. But I believe that longer term we're going to end up in a world where the division between the two different set of networks will eventually disappear, right? And it's not going to be one network to rule them all. There will be networks of networks that will be rolled out, that will be providing value, and it's going to be those interesting orthogonal relationships that exist between the different blockchain networks that I think we're going to see kind of the next level of creativity in this space. So, whether you're a Cosmos fan or a Polkadot fan or a Metronome fan, I think the idea of these network of networks coming together is going to be really, truly fascinating. And specifically the ones, where, you can maintain privacy, you can maintain confidentiality, even in a public setting, right? So I think that's going to be some really, really interesting work, and I'm looking forward to the next couple of years.
Absolutely. You said some amazing things there. I just want to break some of it down, right? One of them was talking about the requirements from enterprises are more tailored towards reliability. They're not really looking for the really shiny bells and whistles. They just want ways that they can collaborate with their partners and their collaborators in a more trusted way. But you also said the evolution towards public blockchain is going to unlock more of those bells and whistles, as well as the reliability that they generate. But from your conversations with enterprises today, how would you characterize kind of their biggest requirements? Is it about security? Is it about collaboration with competitors? What are people actually looking for in the enterprise space today?
I think enterprises are looking for simple things. They're still, they're simple to ask for, hard to build, hard to design. But simple things like just streamlining and optimizing the security posturing around just the end-to-end architecture of systems that include blockchain technologies, right? So enterprise identity. How do we actually prove that an individual who is generating a piece of data that may in fact end up on a ledger, is that person actually the person who actually entered the data, right? So there are still, I think, opportunities around authentication and access controls at the layer before you get to blockchain that we still need to solve for, right? And so it's just simplifying. Work still needs to be done to simplify the kind of the user experience from that perspective. Typically when we authenticate to a network or an application, we do it once, right? And then we in some applications we time that authentication out, right? So after 15 minutes, person logs out, is logged out. But in those 15 minutes, I think there's still an opportunity for someone to potentially enter in malicious information or what have you. So I think that as we look at blockchain technology, with or without the enterprise lens on it, the question I think that still remains is, what is the efficacy of the end-to-end process, right? So not just the integrity of the data, the integrity of the actual, smart contract that is executing a process
Mhm.
on a blockchain network, but rather the end to end, which includes and starts with, the authentication of an individual, and then, going down even further into the future, maybe authentication of a device or an application
Mhm.
that might need to interact with a system that connects with a blockchain network.
Right, right. And you see these kind of use cases popping up, right? Maybe a good way to frame it is around these large use cases from Walmart and from, I believe it was IBM. They were talking about doing lettuce traceability and coffee bean traceability. And, that's not on a public blockchain, that's on a consortium blockchain. But to your point, the requirements there is they just want to know the identities of all their suppliers, where these beans and lettuce heads come from. And
Mhm.
that's already providing immense transparency to these very broken supply chains that are very error prone, manual, et cetera, right? What do you think about the kind of the state of these initial use cases? Are they representative of what enterprises are seeking? Is just like kind of a track and trace to start with?
I think track and trace is a way to get your toes wet
Mhm.
in the blockchain space, right? And again, my own personal opinion, track and trace use cases are phenomenal. I think they've delivered a lot of value, not just in terms of protecting the assets that are of interest,
Mhm.
but also in terms of educating not just customers but entire ecosystems,
Mhm.
right? So there's a lot of value that's been delivered in a lot of the early track and trace kind of blockchain solutions.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's a starting point, right? So that's a starting point to address risk and to address cost. Um, but where we can go from here is how do we flip the equation around? And a good friend of mine, Pinder Wong, he coined the phrase like, supply chains have to evolve and they have to turn into demand chains, right?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Which now we're thinking about this through the lens of how do I actually build a prescriptive supply chain network as opposed to a responsive supply chain network,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? So the idea that I can take a bill of materials, break it down into functional components, and have that even further broken down into each and every single nut, bolt, IC, what have you, being registered as a smart asset with a supply and demand mechanism wrapped around it. So if I know that a bill of materials is going to be posted to a network and there's say an M5 by 30 millimeter screw that needs to be part of that build,
Mhm.
well, that digital representation of that screw can actually go out and actually receive tenders, right? It can
Mhm.
actually be bid on by third-party manufacturers. So the idea of being able to take an entire bill of materials and posting it for an open competition for quality product, right, in response, I think is going to become very, very interesting. But again, this all depends on solving some of the, I think, challenges that still exist, which is around just security and identity and authentication and access controls,
Right.
privacy controls, confidentiality. So we need all of these kind of building blocks in place before we can get to that future end state.
Mhm.
But I firmly believe that that's the direction that we're headed.
Yeah. To all the listeners out there, I think it's very clear from what Anoop said that, blockchain is not a panacea, not a silver bullet in enterprise space, right? It's also not necessarily a catalyst for change. I think we've had discussions in the past, Anoop, about, regulations and compliance being the driver for enterprise change, right? But the combination of a proactive technology like blockchain, where you can see, coordinate people that don't necessarily trust each other in a standardized way, but driven by regulations or desires from a consortium to agree upon, these are the operating rules that we're going to follow. This is kind of how the enterprise space would evolve.
Yeah.
But looking forward to the public chain side of things is very different, right? It's not necessarily driven by a need to fix what's broken in the real world. We're kind of creating brand new ecosystems that will operate kind of in parallel with the traditional world as it is today. Maybe just start with some of your high level thoughts around all the events of 2021 already, and how this is changing the mindset of decentralization of blockchain.
So yeah, I mean we're a month into 2021, and wow, what an exciting month it's been. So I think part of the transitions that we are seeing, or we probably will see, um, is obviously we're seeing a lot more institutional interest in public networks and cryptocurrencies. I think that will continue to evolve, but we are definitely seeing regulators around the world start asking some really good questions, right? Even as late as last year, I think there were still a lot of hesitancy from folks with regulatory roles, but that I think that's changing now, right? I think people are actually starting to look at public blockchain networks as a viable means of not only uh, driving business in open markets, but as a means of driving GDP, right? Maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the road.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when we start thinking about that, then the question becomes what is the role of central bank digital currencies? How do we actually uh, drive kind of a better understanding of that, and then adoption, right? I think we're on a very again, it's a very exciting time, and certainly the first month of 2021 is proving that we're going to be on one heck of a roller coaster ride for the rest of the year.
Yeah, it sounds like a broken record to say this, but this month has seemed like an entire year. But 2021, I think, is a little different from 2020, right? 2020 was all about surfacing the issues, and it
Mhm.
sounds like 2021 would be about taking action against those issues. Don't want to dive too deep into Wall Street bets and the migration from WhatsApp to Signal, but it seems like there's a real movement, at least in the United States, about taking back control, making things fair. But this all starts from these ground up ecosystems, right? It's going to be
Yeah.
a big challenge to really overtake the traditional finance world, but creating a brand new side ecosystem where people acknowledge that, this is bottoms up, user owned, not just about finances, but, we talked a lot about services and assets just in general. Maybe share some of the use cases you think as far as this decentralized services marketplace that you envision seeing soon.
Yeah, no, and one of the reasons why I continue to be in the blockchain space and am so positive for it is, one, it allows us to drive corporate impact, right? So for companies and firms that understand the value of blockchain, um, there is a correlation to benefit, right? Uh, the technology allows us to drive industry impact. So, how do we allow industries to evolve um, and grow essentially, right? But then also the technology allows us to drive and advance and improve the human condition, which I think is the only other technology that has really been able to do that. Is the internet,
Mhm.
right? And so now, we're into this entirely new world, and technology, blockchain technology allows us to do all three of these things, drive corporate impact, drive industry impact, improve the human condition
Mhm.
without really any conflict of interest, right? And so
Win-win-win situation, right?
it's a win-win-win situation. And so, I think the better that we are able to communicate the value of blockchain, the better that we are able to, and without having to think about it, realize the value of blockchain and convey it. I think we're going to be uh, in a very very different space
Mhm.
next year than we are even right now, right? So really excited about that. Now, going back to your question, I think one of the very interesting things that we'll see coming out of this year is, and again, the conversations around CBDCs are exciting and whatnot. But the whole idea of being able to go off and create your own economy, right? As an individual, as an enterprise, even as a nonprofit, I think is very, very interesting, right? And so I look at this blockchain space evolving not too dissimilar from the internet, and there have been past analogies made, but the internet is a collection of networks, right? It is a network of networks.
Mhm.
And the builders of internet infrastructure have been able to ride Moore's law effectively, such that anyone can now go off and buy some basic infrastructure, create their own network, and they can connect onto the backbone of the internet, right? I want to see the same thing happen in the blockchain space, right? Where it's not just your top running DeFi or blockchain fintech companies that are creating these new economies, but getting down almost to the individual level,
Mhm.
right? As an individual, I want to be in complete control of my talent, my assets, how I engage and interact, and I want to be able to do that in a programmatic way,
Mhm.
with rules that are enforceable, right? And so, getting down to, that individual, as I said earlier, how do we improve the how do we improve the human condition?
Mhm.
I think there's a very significant role for all blockchain practitioners
Mhm.
to play in us achieving that.
Yeah. And this concept of like microeconomies that you're kind of describing, right, is very reminiscent of like what's happening with the initial ICOs, except people were kind of crowding around the concept of a token or a future project. But now we're seeing microeconomies being born around real on-chain assets, right? Whether it's these tokens or there's a lot of new things around NFTs or for digital art. People are even tokenizing tweets and tokenizing, different essays that they've written as kind of like the original versions of them, right? And I just saw Mark Cuban is even getting into this NFT space really deeply, thinking about exactly what you're talking about, how everyday people can be empowered by the things that they create from their own minds and intellectual property, right? Um, this has huge implications for social, obviously, but where do you see this concept being the most valuable, or what's next in 2021 for these microeconomies?
So I'm really bullish on the intersection of uh, blockchain and esports,
Hmm.
right? I mean, esports is a digital phenomenon to begin with,
Hmm.
right? And we all know that there are microtransactions that exist, from even your simple iPhone games to some the big platform games that are out there. Um, the ability for a creator to continue to be a creator, and not have to worry about the underlying technology. I think, one, we're going to see some very really meaningful enablement in
Hmm.
that space. But as it's applied to gameplays or game strategies, or digital artifacts like skins,
Hmm.
there is a I think there's a really significant opportunity. Whereas a space, we're seeing some really very cool, not only technical innovation but business model innovation, right? So I think that's one area that I'm really excited about,
Hmm.
as game developers are thinking about uh, blockchain, not just in terms of being able to buy skins with crypto, but how do their own players, their own end customers,
Yeah.
participate in creating wealth for themselves while playing games,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's going to be a very exciting space.
Yeah, I see a lot of innovation in this space about user-owned kind of intellectual property, right? Whether it's things like OnlyFans, you can have your own stream, you can have your own Twitch stream. Even TikTok is making the average person able to go viral in a way that never was possible before, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the capability to connect on a one-to-many basis is already available in these existing things that are starting to emerge and take over the past Instagrams and Facebooks, et cetera. But what you said about the business model has not reached its full potential yet, right? People on OnlyFans are not getting 100% of the payment in a peer-to-peer fashion. People that have their own Twitch streams, Twitch is taking a big cut of that. YouTube is taking a big cut of all creators. TikTok is taking a huge cut of creators, right? So the business models that really disintermediate the companies on an open platform, but still allowing people to trade services and trade insights and trade assets is, I think, the business model that you're talking about, right?
Being able to create and trade at global scale, right? I think is an outcome that we will see, right? But we don't want to force creators to have to be savvy in the technology. Allow creators to be creators, right? Let them create and the way that I want the blockchain space to evolve is again, right, very similar to the way the internet has evolved, right? So IP is ubiquitous, right? The internet protocol is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. 10, 20 years ago we were talking about IP and the innovation of IP and kind of the impact. But now, very rarely do we actually ever talk about, the internet, right? We talk about online gaming. We talk about, voice over IP. We talk about Zoom calls, right? That's where I think where we need to get to, where blockchain is kind of this beneath the fold technology. It's ubiquitous. It's there. We have mechanisms to drive interoperability. We have equivalent switches and routers, right, to do that. The ability to connect these different networks, so that at a certain point in time, if we do our jobs well, all of us in this space, to talk about blockchain would be the similar way. It would be the same as talking about IP today. It's like, yeah, people understand it. People don't have to be experts in it, but it's everywhere. The infrastructure is there, right? And now we can build value-added applications and services on top.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This concept of, owning digital assets that can make you recurring revenue as almost like a passive stream of income. I think this is going to really be the click in people's heads that they think, it's all about money to a lot of people, especially in the crypto space, to bootstrap this, right? A lot of people are here for the technology and the vision, but for mainstream to really buy into this concept, the passive stream of income thing on assets that you already own is very important, right? And an extension of this, we're talking about digital things like essays and art, but IoTeX really believes that there's a draw between the physical and the digital worlds as well, right? The machines that we own, whether it's a computer that has extra bandwidth, or it's a vehicle in the future that can take instructions and give rides, these are hard assets that today we don't necessarily own outright. Especially, we have these smart cars out there today. We own none of that information, right? Which can be used to monetize, to deliver services. So IoTeX really believes in the next evolution of this concept to be delivering ownership and control of our devices and machines to people, as well as the data and value that they generate. So, switching gears a little over to the IoT and the blockchain side, I know you have extensive experience in this area. Where do you see the big opportunities for IoT to help blockchain, and also, I guess, for blockchain to help IoT?
Yeah, and this was one of the things that kind of led us to create the Trusted IoT Alliance back in 2017. Right, it was just, well, just what does that intersection even mean, right? What are the use cases that might exist? What are the technical, hurdles that we have to overcome, right? And so, I'm a big believer that blockchain is actually a major enabler for IoT, right? But also at the same time, blockchain, depending on your design, depending on your protocol, could be an overly verbose mechanism for driving or building trust and transparency, in an edge environment, right? So I think there's still a lot of innovation that needs to happen there. But by and large, if we think about IoT devices not as devices that collect data, they normalize that data, and then shoot it upstream. If we instead of looking at it that way, but we actually look at that as the first the first and furthest out instance of value creation in an operational environment.
Autonomous value creation.
Autonomous value creation in that kind of environment, and that becomes extremely exciting, right? So take know your customer, principles, apply them to devices. Now you've got know your devices, right? You have, hardware root of trust. You have the ability to uniquely identify a asset and an artifact that asset creates, and uniquely identify that from the rest of the IoT devices that are out there. I think we will end up creating, an entirely new data market based on real-time operational events, right? Which I think is going to be very exciting. So now we've got devices that are creating data that are being translated to digital assets, put some smarts around that, and now we've got an autonomous device who is conducting business on my behalf as the owner, right? And now we've got generalized compute out at the edge, and you've got now applications that are running out on the edge for various functions. Now you have know your agent, right? Know your software,
right?
So now it's not only the device, but you can have a collection of applications, low-code applications that are each generating, something specific, something unique, that is then also contributing into the machine-to-machine economy, if you will.
Exactly. Really the underpinnings of the machine economy, like, which is, I guess, defined as, humans and machines transacting in a trusted way, but more so machines transacting with other machines, right? A lot of people daydream about this concept. The truth is, it's still pretty far away, the full machine economy. But in the meantime, a few autonomous machines, a few fractional owners of them, as well as the data that's being transmitted between machines and humans and other machines. These are little microeconomies that we're talking about that are kind of starting to sprout up, right? So, I think this year we'll start to see the first types of autonomous machines delivering value to humans, hopefully powered by IoTeX. But, it's really fascinating to just think about, do you feel people are ready for this concept? Like what's going to make them click and start to buy into this concept?
That's a good question. I think that's the XXX $trillion question, because we don't know how big the TAM actually is yet. Or we're still trying. I think it's a space we're still trying to figure out exactly just how big the pie is, right? But as you look at the potential for machine-to-machine economy, obviously there are applications in healthcare, there are applications we're seeing applications in automotive, right? So one of the things that we were very excited and very proud to do was the first Smart Mobility Challenge back at the Trusted IT Alliance, right? Where Bosch was gracious enough to grant us access to an electric Jaguar, and actually run experiments of what would it mean for blockchain enabling not just a vehicle, but the infrastructure around it, right? So we had a lot of lessons learned from that. Lots of really good use cases. I think one of the interesting use cases that has emerged is, how do you manage consent controls, consent management, right? If we're living in a world where eventually, it's not going to be the next 5 years, but the vast majority of vehicles that are sold to enterprises that, and not to individuals, but specifically to enterprises in kind of a ride-sharing economy. How do we manage consent in that environment? How do we manage consent when we have multiple blockchain technologies, each managing, the access controls to data for individuals, right? So, one, we were able to prove that there's a lot of really exciting innovation here, during that challenge. But then at the same time, we also realized that we are creating new questions, right? And I think so long as we're creating new questions, we always have something important to do in this space, right?
Absolutely. You know, I think it's definitely step by step, right? I think getting the buy-in from, you know, the demand side is definitely important, right? When we think about introducing any type of new technologies to people, you know, it's kind of subjective. There's a saying here, you know, in Silicon Valley, the product has to be 10 times better than the alternative for something to be, or the incumbent rather,
Yeah.
to be adopted, right? And that's very subjective. You know, it can mean enhanced privacy, it can mean enhanced security, it can mean new bells and whistle features. So everything's going to evolve at different paces, right? Different industries are going to be more ready for this than others. And I think you just have to look at the headlines to see where trust is really lacking today,
Yeah.
and where these will start to be adopted, right? But I want to switch gears a little bit. So
Sure.
one question we get a lot, right, or the blockchain industry gets a lot, is what the heck does Amazon Web Services have to do with blockchain, right? You know, of course, Amazon Web Services powers a lot, you know, much of the World Wide Web today. I think, you know, upwards of 75% of startups are on AWS, or at least that was the trend. But how does AWS play into the blockchain space? Let's start there.
So we've got two things. One, or actually we have several things. One, we have two native services, right? So Amazon Managed Blockchain, which today supports Fabric and Ethereum. So you know that is a service that is built out for customers who have a really strong blockchain use case. They have an ecosystem that they need to bring together, but they may not, or they do not wish to build out and deploy the infrastructure, you know, and manage it on their own, right? So, you know, how do we manage and simplify the user experience such that these customers can focus on their business application and leave the work of managing all that infrastructure to us, right? Again, these are customers who are believers in decentralization. They believe in blockchain technology. They want a simplified means of actually standing up a network. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is that we have our quantum ledger database, which is essentially a service that is aimed at customers who want the attributes of blockchain, right? So they want the transparency, they want the immutability, they want the notion that, you know, data can't be changed. They want cryptographic proof of transactions, but they're not necessarily comfortable or ready, or their ecosystem doesn't need a decentralized solution, right? So, you know, the way that we think of it is we have multi-stakeholder systems of trust for centralized and decentralized operating environments, right? So we kind of have something for everyone. And then on the partner side, you know, our mandate is to look at how do we help drive growth within the blockchain space, right? So not just for our partners and our customers, but eventually for, you know, everyday people. How do we help drive growth? How do we help drive adoption? And from that perspective, we are protocol and ledger agnostic, right? We love the entire blockchain space, right? We want all the blockchain protocols to be successful. Obviously, you know, the market will decide which ones are the ones that are going to grow, but we want to enable them all. And so, you know, part of our strategy is as we look at blockchain enablement and blockchain growth, is how do we help solve some of those questions around end-to-end security, right? How do we enable, put solutions and enablement in place such that we have answered those questions for our joint customers, and such that they can focus, we can focus, and our technology partners can focus on building out their blockchain capabilities. And from a solutioning perspective, we're helping to simplify how those solutions come to be, right? So we want to enable everything. We want to help drive growth in this space, but in doing so in a we love the blockchain industry, and how do we help grow it into an even bigger industry?
Definitely. The blockchain space loves you guys too. Just want to let you know. I mean, I think a lot of people consider Amazon as, this behemoth, right? It is behemoth and it has so many business lines. But AWS, it's really important for the blockchain space to benefit from the benefits of AWS, 5 nines of uptime, multi-region duplication, all these things are really powering many of the nodes that these public chains are running, right? But the word Amazon always gets tangled up in just like, or Google Cloud or, Azure, all these other cloud providers, they get kind of jumbled in the blockchain space. Like, how would you characterize or how would you explain this relationship?
Yeah.
To someone that's brand new?
No, and it's a great dichotomy of centralized versus decentralized infrastructure, and kind of how do we make sure that there's freedom of choice, there's independence, all that. First and foremost, we believe in a customer's ability to choose, right? And so as I look at my business, it's about being market aligned, right? It's about making sure that any recommendation that we make is for the benefit of the customer, right? So, if a customer comes to us and says, "Hey, we believe that we want to use protocol, a certain protocol for whatever reason," great. But from an end-to-end solutioning perspective, have you really thought about everything, right? So, while we absolutely want to grow the number of protocols that run on our platform, we also want to make sure that the solutions that are being built out, right? I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves, right? I mean, there is a component of engineering time that is spent towards building blockchain protocols, and there's a portion of engineering time that is built towards application lifecycle management, data modeling, right? Security, physical device design, right? So we have to think about solutions with a holistic lens in place, right? It's not all about just the blockchain protocol or the blockchain network. There's other stuff that has to go around that to make these things viable. And I think that's where we want to be. We want to be the enabler by addressing some of these, potentially not so sexy, functional components, but they're critically required.
Yeah.
In order for blockchains to grow.
Absolutely. It really much resembles the spirit of decentralization, right? It's all about enabling, right? It's about taking what we have already and filling the gaps of, new capabilities to make this entire space function even better. So, it's great to see, Amazon Web Services, supporting many public chains now, and going down that route. So I think very much looking forward to hearing some more updates on that throughout the year. But Anoop, we've talked about a lot of things. Really appreciate all the time and the insights. But just want to leave it with one big forward-looking question. Just looking forward to 2021. What are the big trends we can expect, and what are you personally most excited for?
So one of the things that I'm most excited about is the whole intersection between blockchain and sustainability, right? And I think there is, when we talk about sustainability more broadly, I think everyone naturally gravitates towards, green energy production, solar energy production, and there's plenty of opportunity in those spaces, and we're super excited about that. But I think the definition of sustainability is far broader than that, right? So how do we leverage, and this is kind of a call to action, how do we leverage the value of blockchain technology and the values that we hold within our community to actually addressing, long-term sustainability development goals, right? So how do we leverage that to provide equity? How do we leverage that to provide and improve, water sanitation? How do we eliminate food scarcity, leveraging this technology? And that's an area that I'm personally spending a lot more time. We're actually in the process of launching our next nonprofit in that domain, right? So, you know, we're not going to be in that nonprofit. We're not going to be technology specific. We're gonna hone in on and be laser focused on specific sustainability outcomes
Mhm.
that use a variety of technologies to develop solutions. I firmly believe that blockchain has a critical role to play in that. In at a minimum, providing transparency around reporting, around accountability, around compliance,
Mhm.
right? I do believe that we are entering in a world where you know carbon neutrality is going to eventually become a first class design consideration. Right? We're already starting to see this, right? Uh, a first class design consideration for things like building a car. Right? At what point can we say that the manufacturer of a vehicle is carbon neutral or carbon negative, right? And then how do we prove that, right? And how do we drive accountability and compliance around that?
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be, again, similar to blockchain and IoT. I believe blockchain is an enabler for IoT. I also believe that blockchain is an enabler for sustainability.
Yeah, and that's a very important reminder about the beauty of blockchain, right? We have the opportunity to really impact, not only the financial space, but some of the largest challenges of society around how do we make sure, millions of tons of food are not wasted per year.
Yep.
Renewable energy is not just setting lofty goals for being carbon neutral by 2050, but really action in a way that utilizes technology to the best of their ability. So, everyone definitely check out, Anoop's upcoming Open Sustainability Collaborative, a great nonprofit to use not just blockchain, but the suite of technologies to make our world a better place. And with that, Anoop, thank you so much for your insights today, and just covering everything from enterprise to public chains to microeconomies to sustainability. Definitely an overload of information. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again, and we'll definitely be in touch for future efforts. Thanks so much, Anoop.
Sounds great. Thanks, Larry.